Good Vibrations.
It is episode 123, and on the line today is a previous guest. You may have heard him a few times on Good Vibrations. He tends to be someone we wheel out for three-way roundtable conversations, I've noticed. So he was there when I spoke with Tina Foster for the Paul is Dead McCartney mess a few years ago. We wheeled him out to talk with Neil Sanders about the American 1960s counterculture last year, and he was also there alongside Freeman in 2016 upon the sad passing of Prince. So he's certainly got involved in a few interesting conversations, and he's back for another one today. We're talking my good mate Matt Sergiou, proprietor of the blog sites Conspiro Media and Occult Beatles. Matt, welcome back, mate.
Hello, wheeled out again.
Indeed, like Stephen Hawking, or maybe not.
Yeah, well, no, yeah, right, okay.
Yeah. And you're also a long-suffering DJ, like myself, for your sins.
Oh, yes. Ex-long-suffering club DJ. Yeah, I gave that game up, I don't know now, was it 5 or 6 years ago now? Maybe 7 years?
Man. Yeah.
Yeah, it's changed. It's really changed. I mean, we're about the same age, aren't we? So you remember what it was like when you first DJ'd back in the 1980s. But certainly for me, when I first started back then, it was certainly about the music. That's why I got into it. It was never an ego thing, because I know a lot of club DJs get into it because they have a big ego and they want to push their name around
and
get girls, have a bit of a local celebrity status in the town or the city where they work. But for me, it was about sharing music that I loved playing, and what I've noticed is, comparing now to the 1980s, was back in the 80s, people were open to listening to new music. You could push new music, and people would come up to you and say, "What was that track you just played? I've never heard that before."
Exactly.
And they would they'd ask you for a pen and a paper so they could write it down and go to their local record store and order it or buy it, you know. Yeah. But you just don't get that anymore. It's like people have been brainwashed by Radio 1 and MTV, and it's almost like they're dictated and told what to like. Exactly. And I found that towards the end, when I was pushing new music, people would dance, but they just looked disinterested, almost like indifferent to the whole thing, and they were waiting for the hit records, you know. And I just thought, I can't.
Well, everyone's a DJ these days as well, because of the availability of music to anyone. Basically, anyone can download anything if they know where to go for it. So everyone thinks they're as well informed as the DJ, if not more than. So they think there's nothing special about what you're doing, and they could quite easily do it. And it's a far cry from the way things used to be, because when I started out, the DJ would be a trusted individual who you could trust to educate you, if I can use that word, and take you on a journey, to use that cliche. So you'd have somebody like Pete Tong would come to town, and it would be a Pete Tong gig, and everyone would go to hear what he wanted to play for you, rather than try and dictate what he should play, which is what we've got now.
And you had to pay your dues back then. I mean, I remember when I first started, before I was even allowed to go anywhere near a nightclub, I was doing holiday camps. Glamorous granny contests and such, like in garden
T-shirt and all that good stuff.
Yeah, never got that exciting, I'm afraid. But yeah, so you had to pay your dues. You had to start from the bottom rung and gain the trust of your employers, and also learn the trade, learn how to read a crowd, learn how to fill a dance floor, learn how to deal with different types of music, to respect the different types of music that were out there. But these days, as you say, a lot of these wannabe DJs seem to stem from bedrooms. They do a little bit of a practice session in their bedroom, and then they turn up to a nightclub and expect a job straight away in a big, fully fledged nightclub, and it's just not how it works, I'm afraid, you know.
And have you noticed attention spans to be dwindling? I know it's a few years since you were out there every weekend, but something I noticed towards the end of me doing it, and I can't stand to do it anymore, I gave it up a few years ago, it's just doing my head in. But whereas back in the day, 20 years ago, you could play a tune and you'd hold that floor for a good 3 or 4 minutes, I've noticed that in recent years, you'll get a little whoop and a cheer when the opening bars come in, but then after about 30 seconds, literally, people are looking at their phones, looking bored. Yep. They want the next tune straight away.
Yes, I'm glad you said that, because I thought it was me. I thought it was just me. I thought, am I losing it? Am I losing my touch here? Am I getting too old? Am I getting rubbish? But No, I think it's. I don't know if it's a social engineering thing. I guess it probably is.
It's this culture of instant availability, because everyone's hooked up to the internet all the time now with their phones. They can get any information they want or any entertainment at the push of a button or the swipe of a screen at any time. And so when they're in a club, they hear part of a tune and they get excited, but then they instantly want the next one. It's that Snapchat, Instagram kind of culture.
Yeah, and they treat the DJ like an app. You are like an app.
Well, they treat you like a as well.
Yeah.
No, it's just, like I said, somebody like Pete Tong would come to town 25 years ago and it'd be like, oh, Pete Tong, he knows what he's doing, he knows his tunes. But these days, you're just some random with a laptop to most people. They don't care who you are. They don't care about your heritage in the game. You're just somebody with a laptop and you could be anyone.
A jukebox.
Human jukebox, yeah.
A human jukebox, yes.
Anyway, we sound like that Monty Python sketch where they're saying, when I were a lad, I used to have to walk 20 miles to the nearest well and nearest mine. A couple of old geezers moaning. We should probably move on.
Yeah.
All right, then. So today we're going to be looking at the UK version of the 1960s counterculture. And much has been told on many shows now, including in this series, about the American side of things in those times. So we've covered Haight-Ashbury and Laurel Canyon, LSD, Timothy Leary, Ken Kesey, The Grateful Dead, Jim Morrison and his dad, all these fables that have been often told. But there was a scene that was contemporaneous with all of that running on this side of the Atlantic. And Matt, you've thrown yourself into researching that whole thing in a way that very few others have, as far as I can make out. Somebody had to do the job, I guess. So you've been looking at what was happening in London during those times and the British contribution to the whole counterculture scene of those times. And you've uncovered some pretty fascinating stuff over the months, right?
Yes, I have. I started looking into it. Seriously looking into it, like making a conscious effort to look into it about just over a year ago now. I just dug into a lot of books, a hell of a lot of books. I don't know how many books I read last year, but maybe, 10 or 11 books. Some people listening to this might think, oh, is that all? But for me, that's quite a lot. And I consciously went for books that were written by people that were there, central figures, narrative books, not books written by authors who weren't there looking back on the 1960s as such. I should just put out a disclaimer, really. I'm still very much early in the research here. I've certainly come up with, as you say, some very interesting information that would suggest that similar to what David McGowan found with Laurel Canyon, that there does seem to be some kind of connection in the London counterculture of the late 60s to the military, to intelligence, and also for example, in America there are certain universities that when you read about the 60s counterculture and MK Ultra and experimentation with LSD during the late 50s and early 60s, and there's certain universities in America that the names keep popping up. You'll notice there are British equivalents of that, and one of those is Cambridge University. But there's also places like the London School of Economics, and of course Tavistock. These are just names that keep popping up. It's still very early on in the day to say, for me to say for sure. Yes, definitely there was some kind of conscious plan back in the 1960s in Britain to create some kind of counterculture, some kind of malevolent backstage effort to create a counterculture in order to bring about some kind of social engineering. It's still too early in the day, but having said that, there are certain links that I have found to certain individuals, which does make me want to carry on looking.
There was an article which emerged quite a few years ago. You might be familiar with it. Chris Spivey actually published this on his website a few years ago, and he kind of embellished it and added a few observations of his own. But it was written by a guy called T. Stokes, who was a former British intelligence officer who became something of a whistleblower, and he came forward spilling the beans on a whole load of stuff. This particular article focused on the music industry coming out of London of the late 1950s going into the 60s, and it linked record producers like Joe Meek, Kit Lambert and Robert Stigwood with the Kray Twins. There was Lord Boothby in there, Tom Dryburgh, Brian Epstein, Cliff Richard, and also Screaming Lord Sutch. Quite a motley assortment of individuals. And it was kind of organised crime meets politics meets paedophilia meets military intelligence. It's a very odd mix of influences there. Are you familiar with that article, and have any of those characters come across your radar?
The article does ring a bell. I won't say for sure that I've definitely read it, but it does ring a bell. Yeah, I think I did scan through it, as you say, when it was on Chris Spivey's site. But yeah, definitely. This is one of the accidental things I found as I was doing the research. I wasn't looking out for organised crime to pop up anywhere. I was looking specifically to see if there were any links, as I said earlier, to military, to intelligence, to certain universities, or the London School of Economics, or what have you. But yes, definitely. I by accident, I did stumble upon quite a few links to organised crime. And what I found is, and I might be wrong, I was thinking about this earlier today, actually. There seems to be a borderline. And the borderline is, before the counterculture began, and when we're talking about the counterculture, I'll use the loose term hippies, the summer of love, okay, those key tag words, you know, where in late 1966 into 67 onwards, we had this burgeoning of the so-called hippie movement, where people grew their hair over their shoulders. This is men, of course, and the flared trousers and the LSD and San Francisco and the whole Woodstock kind of vibe. That's the counterculture. That's the hippie culture. But before that, we've got a borderline, and before that, kind of like from about 1963 to about 65, 66, it was the swinging 60s, which is a completely different thing. With the swinging 60s, it's like Mary Quant, the mini skirt. If you think of like programs like The Avengers, which was a TV program that was on in the 1960s, very popular program, it was very much that kind of a thing. It was, in fact, LSD wasn't around then in that culture so much. It was a different scene. So you've got the swinging 60s, and then you've got the counterculture. And what I've noticed is that the gangster element appears to have been more prevalent within that swinging 60s scene, and of course you mentioned the Krays there, very interesting, and Joe Meek, of course, who has links to the Kray Twins. I don't know where to start, Mark. I mean, I found out so much. There's characters like Don Arden, who was a British music manager back in the 60s, who was nicknamed the Al Capone of pop. One of the stories about Don Arden is, and this is something he admitted himself, was there's a particular story where he was manager of the Small Faces, and sometime around the mid-60s, he heard a rumour that someone was out, another rival manager was trying to poach the Small Faces from him. What happened was these henchmen took the guy and dangled him from outside of his office window by his ankles.
Well, this was Robert Stigwood, who was the manager of the Bee Gees,
That's right.
And he went on to be a producer for the movies Saturday Night Fever and Grease. And Sharon Osbourne, Don Arden is Sharon Osbourne's dad, she told this story in a TV show that I saw just last year, and she's gleefully recounting this story and finding it all very funny, and I can't imagine Stigwood found it too funny being dangled upside down from a balcony, but that was the kind of circles that Don Arden moved in, and that's the kind of guy he was.
Well, the interesting thing is, one of the people that was dangling this guy out of the window, well, I'm not sure if he was dangling the guy out the window himself, but he was one of the henchmen, was a gentleman by the name of Wilf Pine. And this is a guy we don't hear much of. Wilf Pine is a friend of the Kray Twins, and he's also, even though he's British, it's said that he's a signed-up member of the American Mafia. Now, I'm no expert on organised crime, but from what I understand, if you're British, that's quite an accolade to be let into the American Mafia. So yeah, he was one of the guys that was one of Don Arden's henchmen. And Wolf Pine, funnily enough, when he left Don Arden's employment sometime in the late 60s, he was one of Black Sabbath's first managers for about a year or two. But the thing with Joe Meek is such an interesting character, Joe Meek. He really is, and anyone who's listening to this, I would suggest you go and take a look at Joe Meek and his career, and just look at any website you can find and just collate enough information together and collect it and just look at it all. It's such a fascinating subject. I mean, apart from the fact he was into the occult, aside from that, yeah, there was a connection, it said, between Joe Meek and the Kray Twins. Joe Meek was homosexual, and we've got to remember, of course, that Joe Meek was the record producer who came to notoriety as a record producer sometime around the late 50s into the 1960s. I mean, people look at Joe Meek now and they say he was a pioneer, a record producer who was a pioneer because he introduced sounds into production that we've never heard before. And
he did the Tornadoes Telstar, didn't he?
That's right, which was an American #1 hit single, which was quite a rare feat back in... This is pre-Beatles, of course. This was 1960, 61. It was quite a rare feat for a band back then, a British band, to make it big in the States. But one of the pioneering things he did was he was working for a record label or a record company as a producer-engineer. And he just upped sticks and decided to make his own studio. And this is quite a radical thing back then. For a guy to just up sticks and go independent. And he built this studio above a leather shop, a leather goods shop on a street in London, like this run-of-the-mill high street in London, Holloway Road, if anyone's familiar with London. And he had a 3-floor apartment, I think, above this shop, and he just turned it into a home studio. And I hear stories, that he would have like vocal booths in the bathroom, and he'd have the drummer drumming on the landing. It was that kind of really DIY operation. But yeah, I mean, a couple of #1 singles came from doing that. But yeah, the thing with Joe Meek is he was homosexual. This was before 1967, so homosexuality in Britain was illegal. So it was very secret if you were homosexual and you wanted to, go about your activities. You had to be discreet, of course. And sometime around 1966 or 67, I'm not too sure, a body or parts of a body were discovered, I think, in 2 or 3 suitcases. And this was in a village in Suffolk, and it became quite a prominent story in the press, not surprisingly. I think what happened was the police found body parts of this one man in 3 separate suitcases, and it was called The Body in the Suitcase.
It was a rent boy,
murder.
wasn't it? A lad by the name of Bernard Oliver.
That's right, Bernard Oliver. That's the guy. He was, I think he was 17 years old at the time. He was murdered, and what transpired was, according to the police, he was raped and then murdered and then cut up into parts and put in these suitcases. These suitcases were found in this village, as I say, in Suffolk. And what the police did was they conducted a search throughout London of known homosexual men to go and question them, basically, about Bernard Oliver. And Joe Meek is rumoured to have been very worried about this because he thought that he was going to be one of the guys that was going to get approached by the cops. It turns out that these suitcases were found 5 minutes walk from the country residence of the Kray Twins. Now, in recent years, I was doing a little bit... I looked into this a few years back, But for some reason, a few months ago, I decided to go looking at this again. And I discovered that one of the brothers of Bernard Oliver in recent years, this is an unsolved murder, by the way, but one of the brothers of Bernard Oliver in recent years has said he believes that the Kray twins were to blame for that murder. Because he heard gossip that there were all kinds of parties with young boys going on at this country residence in Ipswich in Suffolk. So there we have this link here again with the Kray twins, Joe Meek. Was there some kind of connection there with this Bernard Oliver case? Well, we'll never know, because of course a few months after this police hunt began, I think maybe even a few weeks after it began, that's when Joe Meek reportedly shot himself with a shotgun in his flat.
He did his landlady in first. He blasted the landlady of his boarding house to death first, and then he turned the gun on himself. And apparently it was a gun that he got from the bassist of the Tornadoes, a guy by the name of Heinz Burt. And this was February 1967 when that whole case was coming to prominence, as you say.
Yeah. There's something a bit odd about that. There is something a little bit odd about that. I've seen a documentary where Heinz Burt actually talks about this gun, and he says he had this gun to go hunting. He said what he would do is he would put it in the boot of his car, and if he and the band were going on a sort of a nationwide concert tour, he would take this gun with him. And to paraphrase the guy, what he said was, I'd drive along, and if I was in the countryside and I just happened to see a nice suitable scene where I could stop and do some game hunting, I would just stop and just get the gun out and go hunting. Yeah, I don't know, it just seems a bit odd to me that you would just carry a gun around in the boot of... Yeah, the story is that Joe Meek, I think, got the gun out of the boot of the car, or told Heinz Burt to get the gun out of the boot of the car for whatever reason and to bring it into the flat. And that's basically what led to the murder. But Heinz Burt was actually questioned about that, and I think he was arrested and questioned about it, but they let him go. So there is a little bit of it's a bit of a dark shadow over that whole episode, I think.
Wouldn't be the first time, mate.
No.
There's a story that I recount in the new book, which I just stumbled across in my research, which was one of the members of the Tornadoes was a guy by the name of Rob Huxley. And he did an interview with a newspaper one time where he said he did a bit of digging into his genealogy, and would you believe he just happens to be a cousin of Aldous Huxley, the author of Brave New World, the co-architect of the CIA's MK-Ultra program, and the well-known eugenicist from that Huxley notorious family. Just happens to have been implanted in the Tornadoes, like you do. Anyway,
can I just say that there's another member of the Tornadoes. I can't remember his first name. I think he was the guitarist. His second name is Bellamy. It just so happens that his son is Matt Bellamy of Muse.
Wow. Really?
Yes.
Wow, it's so incestuous, isn't it?
Yeah.
And nepotistic. Wow. I was going to say that another character that was entwined in that whole mess with the likes of the Kray Twins and Cliff Richard and Lord Boothby and Tom Dryburgh was, of course, Jimmy Savile, who was very present and very apparent in the whole 60s scene when that whole swinging 60s thing took off. And he toured with the Beatles for a time. I think he was friends with the Rolling Stones. Of course, he presented the first episode of Top of the Pops in January 1964, and he was very much a part of that whole swinging London scene.
Yeah, I haven't really looked too much into Savile, but he would certainly fit into that. You remember when I was talking about the borderline between the hippie era and the swinging 60s? I would say that Jimmy Savile was very much of the swinging 60s part. Sort of like I'm not saying, of course, that after the swinging 60s he stopped operating. I'm not suggesting that. I'm just saying he seems to be part of that particular world, and that would fit with his generation, wouldn't it? Because he was a little bit older in the 60s than everybody else was. He was kind of in his 30s then, so he shouldn't really have been around, really. I mean, he was a bit of an old geezer when you think of the 1960s.
I think he was pushing 40. I think he was born in 1926, so he's 40 in 1966.
Right, okay. Which back in the 60s, was old, yeah. So
indeed. There's also this very bizarre story of was it Ronnie or Reggie Kray? I think it was Ronnie, actually, who told the Krays biographer, John Pearson, that when he was locked up in, I think it was Brixton Prison, Cliff Richard wrote a letter to him to cheer him up. And he says to John Pearson, "Oh, it's really nice. Cliff Richard wrote to me to cheer me up." So it's very heartwarming to hear of Cliff doing his Christian duty, isn't it?
Yeah. Well, the Kray Twins were very much trying to get into the music industry in the 1960s. There's a book, and I've actually put this up on my computer. I'm going to look at it now because the book is called The Krays, A Violent Business, the definitive inside story of Britain's most notorious brothers in crime. The author is Colin Fry. Colin Fry was actually a friend of the Kray Twins' older brother Charlie, and I think, if I'm not mistaken, Colin Fry was involved in the music industry, and he was also he helped in the production of the film The Krays with the Spandau Ballet Brothers.
That's not the Colin Fry that was a spiritualist, a psychic, is it?
Could be.
There was a celebrity sort of mind-reading psychic guy, similar to Derek Acora, called Colin Fry. I just wonder if it's the same one.
Might be, yeah, might be. I haven't come across that myself in my research, but you could be right. Yeah, definitely. The thing is, he's got a sort of a mini chapter in this book about the Kray Twins trying to muscle in on the Beatles back in the early 60s. This would have been around kind of like maybe 1963, when Beatlemania was really beginning to take off in Britain. So the Beatles were beginning to get pretty huge. And the story goes that the Kray Twins wanted to take over the manager's role of the Beatles from Brian Epstein. So what they did was they arranged, this is according to the book, what they did was they arranged to have a meeting with Brian Epstein, and they met him at a gay club in London. And they told him at this meeting that they wanted to take over the management of the Beatles. But Brian Epstein wasn't, from what the book says, Brian Epstein wasn't kind of getting the message. They were doing it quite subtly, and he wasn't really getting the message that they wanted to move in. And there's this account in the book that what they did was that they were talking in the bar, and they grabbed this guy that was walking past in the bar, and they got a nail. One of the brothers got a long nail out of his pocket, and he rammed it through the cheeks of this guy, and then just let him go, screaming in pain. And all these people came over and took this guy away to sort the situation out. But basically what they were doing was they were trying to frighten Brian Epstein into giving the Beatles over to him. So this meeting finished, it ended, and they arranged to meet again. And in the interim, what the Kray Twins did, they went to see an associate of theirs in organised crime in Scotland, and they spoke to this guy, and they said they told him about their intention to take over management of the Beatles. And what this guy said to them was, "Okay, so you want to take over management of the Beatles, but what you've got to realise is if you do this, you're going to have to actually work for a living. You're not, you're gonna. This isn't, because what the Kray Twins were basically doing was extorting money from people. That's how they made their living, right. Which isn't hard graft, as it were. But what this guy was saying to them was, if you take on management of a group as huge as this, you are going to have to be managers. You're going to have to take care of the PR. You're going to have to take care of concert dates,
go on tour,
going on tour, talking to the press, liaising with record companies, sorting out contracts, and so on and so on. So the Kray Twins thought about this, and they thought, I don't know, that does sound like a lot of hard work to us. So in the end, what they decided to do was just to blackmail Brian Epstein, because of course Brian Epstein was homosexual, and we're talking, of course, pre-1967, when homosexuality was illegal. So basically what happened was they just decided, hey, let's just blackmail the guy. So that's, according to Colin Fry, what happened was they blackmailed him right up until Brian Epstein died in 1967. And another interesting story, and this actually comes from one of the members of the bands that were approached by the Krays. and that's Ray Davies of the Kinks, lead singer of the Kinks. And a few years back, he was talking in an interview, and for whatever reason, he just said, "Did you know that the Kray Twins tried to manage us?" What? So apparently the story is that the Kray Twins approached the Kinks, the band that he was the lead singer of. They approached the Kinks management with a view to taking on the Kinks.
So if they can't get the Beatles, they'll have to make do with the Kinks.
Yeah, probably, perhaps. And but for whatever reason, it never transpired in the end. It never happened. But what Ray Davies said was, don't believe that our management wouldn't have handed us over. They would have handed us over to the Kray Twins, but for whatever reason, the deal fell through. Perhaps because of this thing again, where they realised that they'd have to work for a living. You know, they'd have to actually look after this band themselves. But so there's two documented accounts of the Kray Twins trying to muscle in quite literally on the music industry, and at least we can take one for 100% fact, because it actually comes from one of the members of the band themselves.
Yeah, so Brian Epstein died in 1967, the year that homosexuality was legalised, which is a bit of a sick twist of fate as far as he's concerned. The thing about the Kray Twins is they're obviously very psychotic, as you've recounted from that episode you mentioned just there. And this does seem that their behaviour does seem to be very consistent with mind control programming. I know we're darting around a bit here, but many researchers have suspected that the Kray Twins were subject to mind control programming. Military intelligence loves experimenting with twins, incidentally. And you often hear mind control survivors talking about how their mood and their demeanour can switch from being very charming and urbane one minute to being violent and sociopathic the next, which is certainly what we saw with the Krays. So it is consistent with those ideas about them.
I'm not too familiar with the MK Ultra angle with regards to the Kray Twins, but it certainly has been claimed, hasn't it? I think a couple of insiders have actually suggested as much, haven't they?
Yeah, and of course, this type of mind control programming is sponsored by the intel community. So we've got organised crime rubbing shoulders with military intelligence, rubbing shoulders with the music industry. Paedophilia is lurking ominously on the surface. So all these things are interlinked.
And politicians.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Where you find one, you tend to find another. What is that club you mention in your article, this social club, where gangsters would hang out with aristocrats and politicians and such? Which one was that?
Well, there's no one set club. I don't think you're talking about the Christine Keeler article that I've got on the Occult Beatles site. I don't think I mention a club in particular when I make that suggestion.
Prince Philip was a member.
The Thursday Club, that's right. The Thursday Club, which was like a gentleman's club. Gentleman, yeah. It wasn't a club as such. It wasn't a place and the name of a venue. The Thursday Club was the name of the group of people that would meet. And many of the people that would meet within this Thursday Club would meet for lunches and have chats, or they'd meet at a members bar or wherever they saw fit to meet. But it's a very interesting blend of people in there. You've got Prince Philip, you've got Peter Ustinov, the actor, also Larry Adler, the musician.
Yep. David Niven as well?
David Niven. And Stephen Ward, who is, of course, connected to the Christine Keeler Profumo affair, and the Kray Twins.
We'll get on to him. Okay, so we did jump around a bit there, but we had this idea that we would. We're like House of Pain up in here. But anyway, just to get it back on track. So when people think of the American counterculture, they're most likely to think of, as you alluded to earlier, the whole San Francisco scene, psychedelic rock music, LSD, and free love, hippie communes and such. But the British side of things seems to have been largely focused on some different aspects of society, right? And you make the point in your Occult Beatles article, the Keeler article, that it was very much hinged around an art scene and the avant-garde. So what from your research is avant-garde? Because I think it's a phrase that people don't necessarily understand. And would it be safe to say that the British take on the counterculture was centred around the art gallery scene of those times.
Yeah, I suppose it was. I mean, avant-garde is... I suppose, again, I really need... This is, I'm very, very early into my research, and I really need to dig deep into so many aspects, so many things. But I suppose if we were to say avant-garde, avant-garde is like modern art, isn't it? It's abstract. When we talk about art itself, like sculptures or paintings or exhibits of that nature, it's abstract. It's modern art, what we would call modern art. But it also kind of there was another element to avant-garde, or there is. I mean, it's not over. It still continues to this day, which is like kind of like a human living aspect. For example, I find myself thinking of Yoko Ono, who was very much a part of the avant-garde scene of the 1960s before she met John Lennon. I remember one particular case where she was she held an exhibit at one of these counterculture events that took place in 1967, one of these huge events that thousands of people turned up to. It was one of these key kind of like turning point events. And so the story goes, her exhibit was basically her standing on a stage with a dress on, and people were invited to get up on the stage and to cut pieces of the dress off of her with scissors until she was practically naked. And that's kind of like what avant-garde art is. It's kind of an interactive thing as well, where human beings can actually be the exhibit, as it were.
It's art statements, ostensibly, isn't it?
Yeah. In music, it's very much abstract. Again, it's when you talk about avant-garde music, it's like you're trying to scrub. I might have got this wrong, but from what I can ascertain, it's like you're trying to scrub everything in music history that's ever been talked about or taught, and to almost start from scratch. Forget bar structures, forget chord structures, forget the traditional ways of composing music, and just hitting any key on a piano in any particular order. It doesn't have to fit a particular musical kind of key structure. It can go in any kind of direction. So it's abstract. It's like the music version of modern art. It's abstract, The kind of example I always give, and I think it's probably the best, is there was a piece, I think it was by John Cage, who was one of the leading figures in the avant-garde music movement. There was a piece by John Cage which was premiered, I think, in the late 1950s in America, and it was premiered live at this open-air concert. I think it was an open-air concert. And basically what it was this guy walked onto the stage with like the old style pianists with the penguin suit,
right,
the bow tie and all that kind of thing. So he walks onto the stage. He's got the grand piano there in front of him and the stool. So it's all very, it all looks quite traditional at first. Initially, so the audience are looking at this. They think, okay. So he sits down at the piano. He lifts the lid of the piano, and he just sits there. Then he puts the lid back down again. Then he lifts it up again, puts it back down again. And this goes on for about, 2 or 3 minutes. Then he gets up, takes a bow, and walks off the stage. After the concert, people were kind of mystified, thinking, what was that all about? What was going on there? And the argument is that the music, there was music. That was the argument that was given by John Cage and his supporters. Was, well, you don't get it. Well, you just heard music. He said, music? Where was the music? He said, well, he's sitting there in silence, but all around you, in the audience, the ruffling of a paper, of somebody sitting next to you. Somebody might be eating a sweet, for example. They'll ruffle the sweet wrapper. Or a bird tweeting in the sky is part of the musical experience. That's the music.
I don't think you and I would have got away with an avant-garde DJ set where we put a needle on the record, then take it off again, then put it on again. I think we could have expected beer bottles to be thrown at our heads trying that one.
But that would have been part of the avant-garde experience, you see. The people throwing the bottles would have been classed as part of the experience.
Well, that would be part of the statement, yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, the whole avant-garde thing strikes me as something that most people don't get, and it's only intended for a select few in the know, so to speak, and there may not actually be anything to get at all. It's all pretentious, highbrow stuff, and, you know, it's another big con. It puts me in mind of the Situationist International movement, and the ethos of this group seems to have driven much of the punk scene. So you had Malcolm McLaren and Bernie Rhodes, the managers of the Sex Pistols and the Clash, arguably the two biggest punk groups, being stated situationists, and also Factory Records head honcho Tony Wilson, the guy behind the Hacienda and New Order and Joy Division, was a situationist as well. And I think Bill Drummond of the group the KLF was. And they used to make statements like, the KLF burnt £1 million, didn't they? They set fire to £1 million, and they said, "Oh,
well,
it's
that's
an art
very
statement."
avant-garde. You know, that's avant-garde. You know,
that is avant-garde. And they dumped a dead sheep on stage at the Brit Awards one year. So these all seem to be situationist statements, which is a branch of avant-garde, and it's just being pretentious.
I think we have to say why we're talking about the avant-garde. I think we have to. You see, the thing is, it's come out now. This is no longer a conspiracy, quote unquote, theory. The modern art movement of the 1950s and 60s and the 40s was CIA backed, and there were a number of artists within the art field, not the music field, that have been outed. And I think one of them was Jackson Pollock. Was funded by the CIA. So basically what the CIA was doing was funding the modern art movement during the so-called Cold War. And the whole point of them doing this, or so they say, was to prove to the world that America and the West was open, unlike Russia, unlike the Soviet Union, I should say, was open to new forms of art. They were... they did not shy away or turn their backs on anything that seemed weird or unusual, whereas the Soviet Union would poo-poo such a thing. They would look at avant-gardism and modern art and what have you as just ridiculous. Whereas, of course, the West, you know, this is the argument that the West, America, you know, Britain, we're so open to all these great ideas, and we welcome them with open arms, and we've got no qualms or no argument with it. But it was funded by the CIA, and Britain as well was very much a part of pushing this. What happened in the 1940s, just after the war, when the Allies moved into Germany, was there was a move, and it was a concerted move, and it actually took place to change the cultural landscape of Germany, to wipe away Nazism and any trace of Nazism, whether that be in history or literature or music or cinema.
Well, they'd all been flown over to America by then under paperclip, hadn't they?
Yeah, it was the Cultural Cold War. That's kind of the nickname they gave to it, the Cultural Cold War. So the Allies moved in, and it was predominantly the Americans that were kind of instrumental in this. What they did was they set up museums and art galleries and all kinds of things, pushing American culture. So you'd have like museums where you could go and see a Cadillac. So a German could go and see a Cadillac and maybe feel that they were missing out on something, perhaps. Maybe there was some kind of brainwashing going on there, maybe to make them want to live like an American, to push the American quote-unquote dream. So they were pushing this kind of stuff, but concerts as well, you know, classical concerts by American classical composers. And a lot of this was being funded and promoted by the CIA and the US military as well, and of course the UK as well, but not so much as the US was. Now, what happened around this time was a school was set up. It was kind of like a school, but it was also like a summer camp, and it was somewhere where people would meet once or twice a year, and it was somewhere where people could go to share their enthusiasm for avant-garde music. And this Darmstadt school, it was in a place in Germany called Darmstadt. I hope I pronounced that right.
Yeah, I've been there. It's right next door to Frankfurt.
Right, okay. Phew. Okay, brilliant. So the Darmstadt school, which was this place where basically, which was CIA funded, and it was somewhere where avant-garde music was encouraged. So anyone who was an avant-garde composer would meet at this summer camp once or twice a year. It was like a summit almost. So people would meet, chat over stuff, share what compositions they had. There'd be small concerts and presentations and this kind of thing going on there. But it was funded by the US military and the CIA. One of the people that used to go there was Theo Adorno, and John Cage was also there, and Stockhausen, all these big names in the avant-garde musical world. I came across a few years ago an allegation that from one of the people that used to go to these summer camps, summer schools, whatever you want to call it, came across an allegation by one ex-attendee who claimed that Theo Adorno and possibly John Cage were going there on the auspices of the CIA. Now, he didn't explain why they were there on behalf of the CIA, but he was pretty much adamant that they were CIA. Now, to move this on to the 1960s, the avant-garde, why we're talking about the avant-garde is because it was integral to the 1960s counterculture. The counterculture, I would suggest that the counterculture would not have been able, in Britain, and I think in America as well, but certainly from what I found in Britain, the counterculture in Britain would not have been able to have become as strong as it became without the avant-garde movement. And that's art, sculptures, paintings, poetry, books, literature, and the music as well. And that's where we move into the realms of a character by the name of Barry Miles. Barry Miles was this British guy who, an ex-art college student who moved to London. He was from the suburbs. He moved to London, to the city, sometime in the early 1960s. And by the mid-60s, by about 1963-64, he opened up the Indica Bookshop and Gallery. And the whole point of this bookshop and gallery was basically, it was 2 floors. So you'd have one floor where it was an art gallery, which would promote avant-garde sculpture and paintings, and then you'd have the bookshop, which would be avant-garde literature and also records by some of these artists that were, big in the avant-garde world. So you have this shop here, this Indica Bookshop and Gallery, and Barry Miles opened this shop with John Dunbar, who at the time was the husband of Marianne Faithfull, who then went on to become the girlfriend of Mick Jagger, of course. And John Dunbar's an interesting character because his father was connected to it during the war. He was connected to propaganda, and he was also connected to cinema. So again, you could probably say that he was part of this move. This is just supposition on my part, but he was possibly connected to this cultural Cold War, this propaganda to push this avant-gardism, to push this modern art. But that's just supposition on my part. But his father was most definitely in propaganda during the war. And the other partner was Peter Asher. Yeah, Peter Asher, the brother of Jane Asher, who was then the girlfriend of Paul McCartney. So that's how Paul McCartney met Barry Miles, and it was through Barry Miles that Paul McCartney became immersed in the world of the avant-garde. Barry Miles was basically the guy that became kind of like the leading light for Paul McCartney. He was like the shepherd that guided him into the avant-garde world, literature, music, poetry. And it wasn't long after that we began to hear elements of avant-gardism in the Beatles' music, most prominently on the Revolver album, where we've got Tomorrow Never Knows, the song Tomorrow Never Knows, which is probably the first ever commercial mainstream record that has got samples on it, because it is largely made up of tape loops. So the story goes is that Paul McCartney had these tapes, reel-to-reel tapes, and he went into the studio and he just unreeled them off the reels and cut them into pieces with scissors, and then they stuck them all back together and put them so it had this kind of a random sound, which again is very avant-garde. It's all about avant-gardism. The sounds of avant-garde is about random, being random, not having a particular set structure. So we've got this otherworldly sound of Tomorrow Never Knows with these tape loops going on. Incredible. And that was taken very much from the John Cage, Stockhausen school of music. And funnily enough, the song Tomorrow Never Knows is based on Timothy Leary's book about the psychedelic experience, the Tibetan Book of the Dead. And John Lennon wrote this song, Tomorrow Never Knows. And where did he just happen to buy the book that inspired him to do this song? But the Indica Bookshop. So and you know, you hear it on Sgt. Pepper album, you hear it on Magical Mystery Tour. There are elements of it on I Am the Walrus, where we hear on I Am the Walrus, you know, towards the end you get like the radio tuning. Again, I think that was Stockhausen. I might be wrong, but I think it was Stockhausen or Cage, I'm not too sure, where they composed the piece, which is radio tuning. It's just somebody tuning a radio randomly. Yep. And that's it. That's basically the act. But
and the Beatles track, if you can call it a track, Revolution Number 9 from the White Album, I guess, is another classic example of avant-garde
music concrete.
All kinds of stuff going on in that. Not a lot of music. That's for sure. I mean, I think John Lennon even said that it was inspired by Cage and Stockhausen. Well, there's so much that sprang to mind in everything you had to say there. The first thing was that we went about 40 minutes before the first mention of the CIA, which is quite an achievement. But there's so many connections going on there between different groups and agencies and individuals. We were talking about Darmstadt, and I said that it was just outside Frankfurt, and then, of course, I twigged that we have the Frankfurt School, and Theo Adorno was connected to the Frankfurt School, which is all about social engineering. It's connected to the Tavistock Institute in London. There's a CIA connection there to that Frankfurt scene that you mentioned. You mentioned Marianne Faithfull, who was the wife of John Dunbar, one of the partners in the Indica Gallery. Marianne Faithfull was the one-time girlfriend of Mick Jagger, who was educated at the London School of Economics as an economist before he became a rock star. So the LSE is, you know, tied into Tavistock and all these other agencies as well. There's this guy, Michael Hollingshead, as well, who I think was CIA, and he was an associate of Tim Leary's. And I believe he was sent over to London to kind of oversee these cultural shifts that were taking place and to make sure that the CIA's wishes were being kind of rolled out. Do you have much on Hollingshead?
Not really. Just what everybody else has really talked about. Other researchers have talked about. I might be wrong, but wasn't it Hollingshead who actually introduced Leary to LSD? I might be wrong.
It could have been. The thing I remember about Hollingshead is there was some correspondence that came to light between him and Timothy Leary, some letters which have been made available, and they're talking about staging an event in London which would be similar to The Human Being, which took place in San Francisco in January 1967 and is thought of as having kicked off the whole Summer of Love activities of that year. And in this correspondence, Hollingshead is saying to Leary, we could get the Beatles or the Rolling Stones to headline this event. So he's not sort of saying maybe we could look into the possibility of getting the Beatles or the Rolling Stones. He's saying with a great deal of confidence we could get one of these groups to spearhead this event that we want to stage, which suggests that they had inroads into those groups where they could, you know, do their bidding at their will. which certainly ties into this popular suggestion that the Beatles and the Rolling Stones were both products of social engineering at the hands of military intelligence, Tavistock or LSE or otherwise.
I do wonder, whether the Beatles were willing participants in wanting to bring about this social engineering agenda, if indeed there was one. I mean, we don't know for sure, do we? We don't have documentation to prove that the 1960s counterculture, either in the US or the UK, was definitely, a creation of the CIA or MI6 or MI5 or whatever. But
the fingerprints of the intelligence services are all over, particularly the American scene. But it's very difficult to know whether they sponsored the whole thing from day one or whether it evolved to a certain extent under its own steam, and there came a point where it was co-opted and hijacked. It's difficult to know that. Yeah, it is, because you see, I with the Beatles, I'm not too sure at this point in time whether they were willing participants in, if there was an agenda, if they were willing participants in it, or whether they were just led along. I mean, if you put yourself in their situation back then, and you're being introduced to all these wonderful, exciting new things, like LSD. I mean, I've never taken it myself, but people who said they have talk of a great spiritual experience. It's a beautiful experience. If you're being opened up to this kind of a world and everything that comes with it, the parties, the social set, as it were, you're being, these doors are opening that for a Liverpool working class lad, must have been quite awe-inspiring, and I do wonder whether they were willing participants in an agenda, or whether they were led along and then realised later that what was happening was a fix, and they wanted out. Yeah.
I don't know what to think, but certainly they were part of that movement. There's no denying it, whether they were willing or not. They and I wouldn't say just in Britain, but I would say in the Western world, if not the world, the Beatles were the flag bearers, the flag wavers of this countercultural movement, because they were the world's biggest band, and they were very much supportive of the avant-garde movement, of the counterculture, and everything that came with it, and that's everything that came with it. So whether they were or not, the Beatles were most definitely the central kind of unifying figures for it, and they sold it, because if you've got a band as big as them as your cultural spokesman, then you are going to sell the counterculture. It's going to, to let's, for want of a better term, to the ordinary public, who perhaps just, they get up in the morning, they go to work, they come home, they watch a bit of TV, they go to bed. They're not really immersed in the counterculture, because much of what was going on within the counterculture in Britain sort of was pretty much central in London, from what I can gather. There wasn't really much of a counterculture going on outside of London. But certainly when you've got the Beatles selling it, then it helps to widen it. It helps to make it more mainstream. It helps to sell it out of London, to get people to turn on, tune in, drop out. In the suburbs, in sort of towns that are hundreds of miles away from London, small seaside towns or provincial towns, So whether they were part of it or not, willingly, they were part of it. They sold it, and they sold it well.
Well, they certainly came along at a very key time. They came out with their first single in October 62, and then their big year was 63, when they just blew up big time. And then in America, it would have been February 64 onwards, following the Ed Sullivan Show. And this was in the wake of the Kennedy assassination. A lot of people have found it interesting that America was, in grief and trauma at the JFK assassination, and then along come the Beatles a few weeks later, I guess, and there's this new focus for people to pay their attention to. And you've made the point in previous interviews and in your articles that Britain prior to the Beatles was a very grey, austere place. It was still steeped in the post-war era, and you can look at some movies of the early 60s, the very early 60s, 60, 61, to get a feel for what life must have been like in those times. And then all of a sudden you get this dynamic new group, the Beatles, and a year later come the Rolling Stones. Then you get groups like the Kinks and the Who coming through. And in a very short space of time, Britain has been transformed from this grey, drab place to this exciting, vibrant location full of colour and dynamism and all this exciting stuff going on. So some major social shifts in quite a short period of time with the Beatles at the helm.